Hello and welcome to this episode of Law for Lawmakers. I'm Fiona Rutherford, Chief Executive of Justice, and we're a law reform and human rights charity working to create a fair justice system within everyone's reach. This podcast is based on our Law for Lawmakers guide, which helps repair the cracks in the UK's political foundations by giving every MP the tools they need to act as custodians of our democracy. The guide explains the key legal and constitutional principles that underpin good lawmaking, helping parliamentarians and their staff review new laws, table and write amendments to bills, support their constituents, and hold power to account. But this podcast isn't just for parliamentarians. It's for anyone who cares about their rights and how they're protected, how public bodies exercise power, and how our laws shape everyday lives of people across the country. Each episode brings together leading voices from law, politics, and public life to explore the principles that underpin our democracy and to look at Parliament's role in upholding them. In this episode, we're turning to the foundations of our constitutional system, how legality, accountability, and institutional balance keep our democracy healthy, and what it will take to protect those principles in years to come. And I'm delighted to be joined by someone who has played a defining role in these questions over several decades. The Right Honourable Lord Strathclyde is one of the most experienced and respected figures in the House of Lords. A member of the Lords since 1986, he's held some of the most senior positions in Parliament, including Leader of the House of Lords from May 2010 to January 2013. Before that, he held several positions in government, including Minister of State at the Department of Trade and Industry and Government Chief Whip. He was also a member of the Shadow Cabinet between 1997 and 2010. Lord Strathclyde is currently chair of the House of Lords Constitution Committee, guiding its authoritative work on the rule of law, constitutional balance, and resilience of the UK's democratic institutions, including its latest report from last November, The Rule of Law Holding the Line Between Anarchy and Tyranny. Lord Strathclyde, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us here today. We've got much to talk about, and I thought I might start us by opening up the topic of constitutional landscape and what it looks like today. You've seen the UK's constitutional arrangements weather many political cycles, and when you look at the landscape today, what stands out to you as being the most significant pressures or perhaps shifts that Parliament needs to be alive to?
I think the most interesting aspects that Parliament are looking at the moment and is interested in the immediate future is first of all to do with the electoral map, the lowering of the voting age from 18 to 16, which will mean that school children will be voting for the first time in England, although they have done in Scotland and Wales. So that's one aspect of it. I think on a more universal view, looking at how international law operates in practice, for instance, the recent discussions and debates that we've been having on Diego Garcia and the implications for the role of the United Kingdom and for other powers who wish to play a part in it, and the role of the United Nations. I think the role of the ECHR, which I sense without much evidence, is in a state of flux, not just because of the United Kingdom's view of it, but other European nations who feel that maybe there need to be more than just tweaks, but a fundamental re-examination of what it is for. And also wider, looking at who enforces international law, what is it for, how does it work, and how should we as a British state, but also as British people, how we should react to being told what to do, I suppose, what might be called a bunch of foreigners, when we have a clear understanding that the rule of law is about what the British Parliament does on behalf of the people who elect it. So that's not a bad constitutional mix that we'll be following over the course of the next few years and seeing how they all land.
Yeah, so I mean, as you're inferring, if not explicitly saying, the constitutional landscape doesn't remain static. There's evolution through practice, through convention, through culture as much as from law. And from your vantage point, how do these norms get sustained or sometimes even stretched into the realities of modern politics? You've given some examples, but...
Well, first of all, I think you put it very well. The British Constitution, as everybody knows, is not a written constitution, although it is written in many places. But the key part of the British Constitution is its innate flexibility and the ability to change, to adapt, to grow, to evolve, as it has done over 300 years, with minimal civil strife or revolution or all the other kinds of changes that have affected people with more direct type of constitutions. And that is a great thing that the United Kingdom should be proud of. I think people who recognize it are proud of it and feel that it's worked. And that's how it is able to adapt without looking to amend or go to a constitutional court to see the judgments. We hold our politicians responsible for creating a government and for making sure that our constitutional arrangements work as well as they possibly can.
You've mentioned Parliament. Parliament's role I'd like to move on to in safeguarding the rule of law. This is an area that you know very well now, having, as I've said, chaired the Constitutional Committee's work on the rule of law. And Parliament clearly plays the pivotal role in maintaining the balance of power between the various parts of our state in the way that you've just highlighted. In practical terms, though, what does executive, or effective, I should say, rule of law scrutiny look like from Parliament, especially when dealing with complex or fast-moving legislation?
It is because there are so many complex issues that are dealt with by statute that you need to have a very straightforward and simple approach to an understanding of what is the rule of law, and particularly supporting the institutions. So the institutions, obviously, of the courts themselves, how the judiciary operate, understanding that the role of the judiciary is to interpret the laws that have been passed by Parliament, not just to make it up as they go along, and to support the ideas that come out of the Supreme Court, rather, as we have seen in a relatively recent past, blaming members of the judiciary themselves, which is not a good way in encouraging people to respect the standards of the judiciary and the rule of law. And it is something that politicians really shouldn't do. But there's also analysis by parliamentarians themselves who need to understand what lawmaking is, how it operates, what the judiciary is for, and what their role is. And when they see a judgment that they disagree with, it's not enough simply to blame the judge. It is to go back to the basic law and say, did we get it wrong last time? Should we now be changing it? I can see how a lot of legal questions today are very fast-moving, the whole role of AI, online safety, and so on. But I still believe that rushing the fences too fast will lead to long-term damage rather than taking your time, taking a little bit of care to try and get the lawmaking right, which is most of the time the best way of doing it.
And something that's covered in the Law for Lawmakers Guide, that important role that legislators play of scrutiny. They are very much the front line of the law creating process. The committees, though, are another part of the legislative process, the bill committees. And these committees and legislative standards are essential, but sometimes underappreciated part of the scrutiny. You might pose it as a question, but also to add, from your experience, which tools or practices make the biggest difference in upholding constitutional accountability? What's the role of the committees? What are there other parts that we should highlight?
I do think legislative standards are very important. And yet they are the unloved part of the legislative making process. People think it's all about making a flowery speech which will bend the committee's way towards what they think. And actually the structure of law, the clauses, the way it is built up, and from my point of view, most importantly, the role of secondary legislation and secondary legislation making powers, or what are called Henry VIII powers, ruled by decree. These are inevitably enormously attractive to governments and to ministers. It doesn't matter where they are from, and I hang my head in shame as a former Conservative minister when I'm aware that we had more secondary legislation than was perhaps needed. And The reason why there is so much secondary legislation is it makes up for a lack of thought by ministers in the first place. It's normally because ministers can't decide whether to go this way or that way, and their officials will say, aha, the solution is obvious, minister. Have an order-making power and you can make up your mind at leisure, which sounds very attractive, but of course it's not the right way of making law. It does not allow for the scrutiny of legislation within the parliamentary process, which aids coming up with the right answer at the right time.
And talking of the executive, as somebody who is a former government minister, and the sort of the balance and accountability between the executive and the legislature in particular, during the time that you've now served in the Lords and had a foot, if you like, in both parts, you'll have seen the balance between the executive and the legislature shift in various directions. How would you characterise those in a sort of longer term trend perspective? That sort of balance?
Yes. Well, you're right to say that there is that balance, and it does change. The fact is, most governments don't like being told what to do by Parliament, and they go out of their way to stop Parliament from really having too much of a view. The House of Lords, where I come from, is fundamentally different because it is there to revise legislation, to scrutinise legislation, and then to debate some of the great issues of the day. Almost by definition, it is once removed from the political rough and tumble which exists in the Commons, and that is rightly where it should remain. But to try and offer to governments there is an alternative, there is a better way. I think particularly for a new government, it's much harder to accept that kind of compromised way of legislating and coming to an agreement. They want to be tough, and I've seen many previous governments in the same way over many years. They want to be tough and they say, no, this is the right way, this is what we're going to do, rather than listening to the parliamentary process. And what I'm convinced about increasingly as the years go by is that it would benefit everybody if governments stood back for a moment, and when I say governments I mean ministers, and said to their officials, bring me what is the best out of these arguments, and are there changes that we can make that will be seen positively by the people that we are trying to exert some sort of control over. And that would be a better way of legislating.
So thinking of a time where that sort of balance has worked well, what conditions, be it cultural, political or procedural, do you think has made that sort of balance work to the best of its ability?
Well, as you're asking the question, I'm trying to think of times where it has worked well. And all I think of are possibly times when it hasn't worked so well. So, for instance, the introduction of the poll tax, the later part of the 1980s, some of the changes that were made by Michael Howard in the 1990s, or indeed David Blunkett in the early part of the century on terrorism legislation, which was immensely controversial and needed not to have ended up in the kind of rows that they did. Today, there are changes to laws suggested by Parliament every week. Very few of these are taken up. Fundamentally, the adversarial approach in the House of Commons and the House of Lords is the right one, is the best way of the hammer and the anvil, beating out some of the right ideas. But in the end, it also does require a government to say, shrugging its shoulders in a way and saying, well, perhaps there's a better way than the one we first thought of. And that is true also for officials within departments who need to be a little bit freer thinking in their ideas before coming to a conclusion with the ministers that they are there to serve.
And in those examples, the poll tax or the example with Blunkett, is there a common theme, I should ask, around the sort of cultural or political or procedural context in those times? Maybe there wasn't, I don't know.
No, I don't think it's so much procedural. The procedure on the whole is the same. There is if I can use this dreadful word, a sort of machoism about ministers and ministerial office who want to have their bill, and then find it very annoying when somebody comes along and says, it's a very good bill, but we can improve it. And that is very often not what they want to hear. And I mean, what happens when we get bad laws passed is ultimately they come a cropper in the courts. and the courts say, no, this doesn't work. This does not provide for stopping whatever it was we were trying to stop. Go away, think again, and go back to Parliament and come back with a different law. And so we do have the processes and the procedures to be able to change things, but I think that there are probably easier ways of finding and listening to good common sense that can emanate from Parliament and the parliamentary process.
You just touched on the courts, and I was going to move us on to constitutional interpretation and public understanding, and state the obvious that you've already mentioned, which is that courts sit at this key junction between the executive and the lawmaking body, which is the House of Commons and the House of Lords. How do you see the court's role today, particularly in terms of maintaining constitutional boundaries without stepping into that political arena? How is that working in your
Yeah. Well, it is now 20 years since the creation of the Supreme Court. So we've had plenty of time to see how it works in practice. And we are genuinely blessed in this country with some of the brightest minds of people who join the judiciary and work their way up to the Supreme Court. So it's an extremely effective body. And of course, the Constitutional Reform Act of whenever it was, 2005, 2007. Yeah, they didn't change the role of the courts. The role of the law lords and the role of the Supreme Court is still very much the same today. I think what is confusing for people generally is they see something called the Supreme Court. They immediately think of the United States or they think of other countries. And they don't always understand where our Supreme Court fits within the parliamentary process and the accountability that democracy brings. They do not sit there on their own without the support of the other institutions that make up our constitution, which of course at the heart of it is Parliament and the executive that is decided by Parliament itself.
So, given the pressures on public trust in institutional bodies more broadly, a lot of which the three you've just described, obviously being the key institutions that make up our constitution, what do you think helps build confidence, particularly in the judiciary, sticking with the courts for now, and in the legal system more generally? What's the thing that either exists now that helps build trust, or what more could be done to build further trust?
I think there are two things. First of all is a fundamental understanding, which on the whole there isn't through our school system. There is very little public education, civil education about the kind of structures, whether it's from how local authorities work or magistrates work, going up to the Supreme Court. These are not difficult concepts, but unless they are at some stage given an opportunity to learn about them, they never will. We watch far too much American-type films where we see their Supreme Court operating, or we read about them, we read about the battles they have with the US president. And it is a completely different way of looking at the law and the rule of law than we have in the United Kingdom. The second thing is that those of us who believe in the institutions of either of the judiciary or of Parliament, most of us do, we need to support each other. We need to see that the institutions are stronger than the individual. And the institutions are there for the long-term public good and the sort of public health of the nation, to make sure that democratic norms work, to make sure that what I called in our report, the culture of the rule of law is in existence, that people understand how it works, that they uphold the rule of law. That I remark that one of the things that destroys a belief in the rule of law is if people see everyday low-level crime, people getting away with it, whether it's shoplifting, whether it's street crime, or all sorts of things, or indeed at a very high level, people getting away with it. They don't like that, and they are right not to like that, and so we need to support the institutions and the enforcement to make sure that these problems are put right.
So looking ahead, what does genuine constitutional resilience look like for the UK over the I don't know, next 10, 20 years? Where should our attention be?
It's a good question. You're inviting me to look into the crystal ball and see what problems there are ahead. I mean, I've always been worried about this thing called the United Kingdom, which I think is enormously precious and very important. And I know that there are different arguments about the role of the different parliaments that devolve administrations in Scotland, England, or indeed devolving more powers within the English counties, in Wales and in Northern Ireland. I think we need to remember that we need to keep strong the central organisation that unites us all. And there are huge constitutional implications that emanate from that. And again, there is a certain requirement to understand how all these different things operate, how different elections take place at what stages. And so I suppose at some stage there will need to be a proper re-examination of all of these and an understanding, and therefore an acceptance from people that these are the structures that serve their interests and the interests of the nation at the same time. I don't think we're there yet, and I'm not sure the timing is there, but if you wanted a long-term look at the way our constitutional arrangements work, that is one way. I think the other thing is I'd say I would really argue very hard against having a written constitution. Some people want a written constitution because they think it's simple and straightforward. You can find it in your library or your local store. But that isn't a sufficiently good reason to throw away the innate flexibilities and ability to evolve that we have created over hundreds of years.
Well, as in your role as Constitution Committee Chair, Constitution is clearly something you think an awful lot about. And from the vantage point that you have, are there areas that you feel deserve deeper scrutiny in the years ahead over and above? So how power is devolved sounds like would be potentially one area that you'd like to see greater scrutiny or greater thought about. What else?
Well, one of the changes that has taken place over the last 150 years, for instance, is that local government played a far greater part and a far greater role within their local areas than they do today. Today they're almost seen as agents of government. And I'm not sure that that is the right balance to have. And I can certainly see a greater role for good quality local government civic structures operating within their own basis, to which, of course, critics of that will say, well, there's a reason why you had the centralization in the 20th century. They weren't very good at it. But then again, you look back at the Victorian period, so many of the great cities of the United Kingdom were created with a tremendous sense of civic pride and of civic rule, I suppose. Some of the great buildings and railways and all the rest of it that were created then. That is not an appeal to go back to a Victorian age, but it is to understand that there are different structures that have served us well in the past, and perhaps we should look again at how they operate now. I think another thing is that we do have an overcomplicated basis for creating statutes. The creation of law continually is longer and longer and overcomplicates. We need to find a way of cutting through this, and part of that is to work with the judiciary and with people who use the judiciary so that they are not perceived to be a bunch of clever lawyers who are trying to undermine the law, but actually finding ways of trying to find the right solutions for the right problems, not just of today, but of the future, in a fast-changing era.
Well, that point about localism, I think, ties neatly with your point about culture and people understanding what the rule of law really means to individuals. I mean, having the ability, whether it's through local government or something similar, that sort of proximity to lawmaking may well be something that means that culturally we're moving in. I pose it slightly hypothetically, but I'm struck by the link between your point about there not being enough education and understanding about the rule of law, and hence your the public legal education point. But we have swathes of adults who will be feeling and living and breathing it every day, but probably not describing it in the way that we're talking about it now. And maybe there is something about local or more local power structures that would help.
I do think there is something in that, an understanding of localism. But also, it does require a younger generation to be educated in an understanding of how this society that we all grow up in and the kind of things that we all want, how it adapts and changes to different needs. And it's not good enough simply to go on straight corners or join demonstrations. There are actually perfectly legitimate ways of changing laws and seeking to improve things rather than doing that. But it does require a fundamental understanding of how the current structures work in practice.
So despite some of the challenges which we've covered in our conversation today, what are the things that make you optimistic about the future of the rule of law in the UK?
Well, generally, I am very optimistic. I think it's very easy in the UK to be very pessimistic about everything. Nothing is as good as it was. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are some very good things about the United Kingdom. And sometimes it's only when you go abroad and you see what is happening in other countries, which seem relatively stable, but aren't. And you look back at the old United Kingdom, doing rather well in its stability. What some would say stuck in the past, I don't think it is at all. You only have to look at the role of technology today in Britain, the revolutions that we have lived through, from the role of television, the role of mobile phone technology, to the real revolution of the internet and now AI in certain undefinable ways, but we know it's going to make a difference. We don't quite know where and how and what, but we know it will. And we approach these challenges in a very open and very optimistic way, optimistic for our children and for their own futures and the decisions that they will make and the businesses that they operate in, or indeed in the public sector that they operate in. I do not think that the public sector is immune from needing to find positive changes to make sure that they are efficient and reactive to the needs of modern society as possible.
So a question that we pose to all our guests, and this is really directed for new parliamentarians, be it in the House of Commons or indeed the House of Lords. What one piece of advice would you give them about understanding and upholding the rule of law in their given role?
The one piece of advice I would give to all new parliamentarians, whether in the House of Lords or in the House of Commons, is choose a bill in which you have an interest in, and be part of the process from the publication of the bill to its first and second readings in either house. Sit on the committee stages, understand what the discussions that are taking place, the compromises that are required between ministers and backbenchers in both houses, right through to third reading and ultimately to it getting royal assent. And then you understand how laws are made. And it's only when you understand how laws are made that you understand the practical advantages of the systems that we have and the way that things are done, and can also think of the improvements. I think if it's very difficult to be an effective parliamentarian without understanding the structure of how laws are made in practice.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And of course, the Law for Lawmakers guide that Justice published at the beginning of last year, or mid of last year, may well also provide some guidance in terms of how that structure works. But I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Lord Strathclyde, for sharing your perspective on this important topic. And thank you for listening to Law for Lawmakers. We designed this guide not just for parliamentarians, but for anyone who cares about the rule of law, whatever your background. To learn more about our work and to access the guide, visit www.justice.org.uk. And if you found this episode insightful, please do like, subscribe, and share it with your colleagues, family, and friends, anyone indeed who cares about the future of our justice system. I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode.